Unfortunately, I think that's by and large true. I think Maliki has become a big problem inside Iraq, and that's why, you know, I mean, you're seeing him be forced out now and everything he did. But basically, Maliki decided to fuel sort of the sectarianism and fuel for his own political designs. Thank you very much. And that's a very, you know, he wasn't about building a representative government. He wasn't about inclusion. He was about, basically ended up being about cronyism and his own power game. And that's sort of, what I would say about that is, part of the dynamic of withdrawing American troops the way we did. Now, there were many mistakes made in the war by the Bush administration, so this is not blaming it on the Obama administration solely, not by any stretch of the imagination. But by pulling out all the American troops, we gave up almost all of our cards for influencing the Iraqi government, okay, in terms of influencing their behavior, because we didn't have that force there to basically say, hey, we have interests in what's going on forward. It's very interesting, but what filled that vacuum, right? Iran did on the Shiite side, and on the Sunni side, the Islamic State did, ultimately. And their allies, the Ba'athist allies, their other allies, other anti-Iraqi government forces that are opposed to us and our interests, right? So the whole point is here is that, you know, I understand why people are wary of the Iraq war and that whole thing. I get it, believe me. But here's a good example of once you're down that road where when we pull out and cut and run, basically, you know, our enemies on both sides fill the vacuum. And the selling out of what you're talking about exactly occurred. In fact, Maliki decided not to put in any of the Sunni forces on the security side. He decided not to integrate them in the Iraqi government at all. And that's been a big problem for us because now you have these Sunni allies of ours who are either stood down as the Islamic State and Ba'athist allies of it took over and came in on the charge, or even flip sides. You know, and that's the point here, is that this is, you know, we're all humans, right? This is a contest of wills. And the point is that if we don't have a will, our enemies still do. Well, I'll say this about the funding. I haven't seen any evidence that there was a conscious decision by a nation state to fund the Islamic State for precisely the reason you outlined. They're basically against every other nation state out there. However, the problem is that some of these nation states, like Qatar in particular, have a very permissive fundraising environment. And some of these guys, the Qatar government, the government of Qatar knows, for example, that some of al-Qaeda's biggest fundraisers openly operate there. They know that, and we've told them to shut them. We tried to shut them down, and they haven't. And you can go back through Treasury Department designations, State Department designations by the Obama administration, and you can see time and again we're naming, you know, members, people in Qatar who are basically doing this fundraising. My guess is that some of them are also fundraising for the Islamic State. However, I would say that there is some evidence that the Islamic State basically had to find ways to become self-sufficient in terms of fundraising, more than just depending on Gulf donors. And part of the reason for that is because of the conflict with al-Qaeda. Because one of the things that al-Qaeda still controls for the large part are the Gulf donors. This is part of the untold story here. And essentially when the Islamic State got into a fight with al-Qaeda, Daddy cut off the credit card and said, you can't have your Gulf donors anymore, right? And so the Islamic State had to figure out ways to do that. And so that's why you see them place a premium on seizing oil fields, for example, that they can sell the oil on the black market or elsewhere. That's self-funding. In Mosul, for example, even before they took over Mosul in June, they were already collecting taxes from the local businesses. You know, they were already functioning that way. They've been doing all sorts of things to basically raise funds beyond the sort of donor network. I'll say this, at this point, there's been some really bad work been done about how this is going to influence the global competition in the global jihadist world. There's this whole thesis that all these al-Qaeda branches were going to flip over to the Islamic State and pledge their allegiance to them, and we haven't seen any evidence of that at the leadership level at all, okay? In fact, what we see is basically, as I've said over and over again, what the Islamic State is doing is they're poaching the hotheads, the young recruits. So far, that's mainly who they get. Now, they get some isolated leaders in Pakistan, for example, and Afghanistan, or in Indonesia. They get some leaders here and there, but not from any of the major branches of al-Qaeda, not from any of the major jihadist groups. Mainly, I describe them as B-listers. And the reason for that is that, you know, how do I put this? Well, the Islamic State is brilliant tactically. It remains to be seen if they can translate that into strategic gains, because it's an organization that over time has had a lot of strategic flaws. And al-Qaeda knows this, and this is part of the reason why al-Qaeda decided to disown shown them, because they don't believe that this group could translate their tactical gains into strategic gains. And what I mean by that is al-Qaeda has taken this idea, I think much more nefarious over the long run, which is basically they want other jihadists around the globe to come to them and sort of adopt their position, their jihadist program for themselves and buy into the ideology. They don't want to have to basically point the gun at them and tell them this is what you need to do. And al-Qaeda has had some success, has actually had a lot of success doing that. The question remains whether or not, in terms of this competition, basically the Islamic State can outmuscle the ideological opposition to it within the jihadi world, and that remains to be seen. Yes, they do. They come from everywhere from Russia to Egypt to throughout the Muslim world. They have ex-army officers from all these different militaries who have been basically integrated into their chain of command. Primarily, of course, former Iraqi army officers under Saddam who have been integrated in the chain of command. That's a big part of their tactical expertise and where it comes from. But one of their leading military commanders right now in Syria is a Chechen, a guy who is very well trained and is very capable from an operational standpoint. What's interesting about this is something that they sort of either stumbled their way into or directly copied from al-Qaeda, because al-Qaeda has done the same thing. Al-Qaeda, going all the way back to the late 1980s, had trained ex-army officers from Egypt and elsewhere who basically designed their jihadi program. They came in and designed how they were going to go through training. And they have very, efficient camps for training these guys, indoctrinating them. They figure out who the most capable guys are, and they try and groom them for leadership positions. So they are a very disciplined fighting force in that way. Well, the Kurds are one of those allies who should have been getting support right from the beginning, both in Syria and northern Iraq. If we had any strategic foresight at all, there should have been a program years ago to make sure that they were ready for this. One of the worst things that I've witnessed is that the Kurds have been getting beaten back in some cases with American-made weapons that were given to the Iraqi government and captured by the Islamic State, while we will not supply American-made weapons to the Kurds to fight them off. And eventually there was some flow of arms has gone into the Kurds in northern Iraq. The last press account I saw said it was a trickle. I don't know exactly how much it is. I don't have that kind of information. But the Kurds are clearly one of the forces that we should see as a long-term ally in all this. They are one of our greatest allies in the region in terms of fighting the common enemies. And on the Syrian side, there are some Kurdish actors that we don't want to get in bed with, but that provides all the more reason to get in bed with the guys who we do want to support against our common enemy. So the Kurds are, if we're thinking strategically, the Kurds are one of those allies that basically should pop up to the top of the list. Well, I think it starts with basic education. And let me put it this way. How many people here have read the 9/11 Commission report? More than usual in my crowds, okay? More than usual. But it's not a perfect report, okay, by any stretch of the imagination. But the 9/11 Commission report provides more understanding of the depth of what these guys wanted to accomplish than a lot of other sort of summaries of what's going on. And if you read that report, you can see that bin Laden had very long-term designs on sparking the revolution throughout the greater Muslim world, and certainly within the jihadist community. But that message, think about it, has that message been translated to the American people at all? No, right? We had a war on terror, right? Which I understand why they came to that language, but it was imprecise in terms of explaining exactly that we're in an ideological fight. Right? And that message, the basics of the 9/11 Commission report and what is these guys actually envisioned have never been translated to the American people. So how do you build support for the American people for a long fight if they don't even know who they're fighting? Right? And so there are a lot of people who believe, and part of the confusion too there is, we've gotten into this PC world where, to discuss any of the ideology behind any of this is now going to be offensive to the religion of Islam or to all Muslims, right? But I think this is ludicrous, because if you actually get in the ideology of it, you realize that we have a lot of Muslim allies, and if you can actually explain it in those terms and what exactly is going on, these are ideologues within that whole system of thought who are trying to basically convince people to their side. You can also then identify the people who are not going to come to their side, But again, talking about the ideology of it, the jihadist ideology and what's driving it, where bin Laden and al-Qaeda set out to commit their political revolution. I mean, how many people here have heard them talked about as political revolutionaries? One, two, maybe three, maybe, I mean, that's a different, that's not, I I think that's obvious, you know, but that's just an obvious sort of way of looking at them that we don't even share amongst ourselves, right? So all the basics of this thing have not been explained at all, right? And so people are wondering, and you look at the world, take out a map, take out a mental map for a second, just think about this, right? The jihadists are fighting everywhere, right? Some of them are formal al-Qaeda branches, some of them aren't, some of them are linked to al-Qaeda. I won't get into all that nerd discussion here, okay? But just take out the very simple basic map for a second in your mind. The jihadists are fighting right now from West Africa through North Africa, the Sinai, right? In the territories surrounding Israel. They're launching operations in Lebanon. They're fighting in Syria, Iraq, right? Throughout the heart of the Middle East, Yemen, right? All the way into South Asia. What is that? Right? Is that something you can say is a one-off problem here and there, or is that a global problem? Right, and you're in a global fight. But yet, even that simple map isn't often presented to the American people to explain what's going on. Because it's too...
The president should do that.
Well, I think the president should do that. But I think that, you know, the problem is that it basically brings about all sorts of policy discussions in the wake of the Iraq War, in particular, that people don't want to have. Because the idea is, and I've had people say this to me many, many times, you know, for example, when al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb overran Mali, much of Mali, right? The argument was, well, it's not really al-Qaeda because we don't want to get involved. That was the argument I heard in this town a number of times, right? Now, the leader of al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb has sworn a bayat, a personal oath, Ayman al-Zawahiri, meaning, and as they say, it hangs around his neck, which means if he violates it, you should take his head off, right? That's what it means. That's how serious they are about this. But there's all sorts of intellectual contortions to basically say, that's not really al-Qaeda. And ultimately, who decided that the al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb's presence in Mali, a backwater if there ever was one, was a strategic threat? The French, led by a socialist president.
Jim Woolsey, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I wasn't going to say anything, but your comments about Iran especially suggested to me that I ought to mention something. It's a subject of an op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal called Electromagnetic Pulse. And the issue is whether a country can move relatively quickly based on pretty rudimentary nuclear capabilities, such as a simple nuclear weapon, a Scud missile, to utilize electromagnetic pulse to take down systems of electronics. Now, the United States is the most electronically dense society the world has ever seen. And about 1 million times, today's electronics are about 1 million times more vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse than they were in the early 1960s when people began to discover that a nuclear detonation could fry electronics even a great distance away. For a number of reasons, this has been sort of held in very classified channels until quite recently, but it's now coming out. And I would suggest it might be interesting with Iran in mind and the possibility that it would be able to essentially bring about huge damage to the United States relatively easily in the relatively near term. We're going to have to rethink some of our concerns about our dealings in the Middle East and our concern about Iran, because it may be sooner and more of a problem than we think on the Caliphate and other circumstances.
I think it's right. I mean, the Iranians, again, as you can tell, I don't trust them in any of this, and I consider them, you know, on par our great strategic enemy of the U.S. and our interests. And I warn you that they can potentially cut a deal with any actor in the Middle East, including the Caliphate eventually. Oh, great question. But these are nerd questions now, so now you're making me answer on a nerd basis. What's interesting about this is talking about underestimating a threat. When the Islamic State was fighting mainly in Syria, but still fighting in Iraq, and took over the Raqqa in Syria, you saw estimates that said they basically had somewhere, anywhere from, depending on who you talk to, 3,000 to 8,000 fighters. This was at the time. This was over a year ago now, okay? What I thought was wrong about that assessment at the time is Raqqa in Syria had a pre-war population of over 300,000 300,000 people. The idea that they're fighting throughout much of Syria, controlling a city and a province like that, and also fighting throughout much of Iraq with just several thousand fighters struck me as sort of, we're missing something, right? And I think that the number of fighters is probably a lot greater than a lot of these official assessments you see in the press have said. And if you just take out a map, I think that's kind of obvious. If you look at all the areas where they're fighting. Now, they also have force multipliers. One of the things that you can't discount is the degree to which they're cooperating with the Ba'athis in Iraq, for example, in the offensive against the Iraqi government. So it's tough to count, you know, forces in that way. But I think it's got to be greater than 10,000 total troops. How much greater, I'm not sure exactly, but it's certainly not in the several thousand range. I think it's 15 to 20,000 is sort of a ballpark, I would say, for a minimum bound. I think it may be even greater than that, and it's growing. But how many? They don't publish rosters, you know, so we don't know. This is part of what they do. Now, how much ideological control they have? Well, it's very interesting. Baghdadi and his subordinates have had to kick out a number of people who didn't fall in line within the organization. There's evidence that the original war minister of the Islamic State of Iraq, for example, who rose to power at the same time Baghdadi did in April 2010, has basically been cut out of the organization because he went back to al-Qaeda's fold and didn't want to go off the cliff with Baghdadi, essentially. So they've been taking a number of steps. They actually reformed themselves internally. They had something called a war ministry. Now it's a war council. They had a number of different bodies that they basically reconstituted themselves to breed ideological indoctrination that's loyal to Baghdadi and his ideology. How successful they've been so far in that, I'm not sure entirely, but I know they've had this effort underway for a while. And they're creating in terms of their ideology, they're creating this sort of, again, I call them the hybrid, sort of the bastard child of jihadism and Baathism, right? And part of that is because they're trying to develop this cult of personality around Baghdadi. And that part of that is also for ideological indoctrination purposes, and they're having some success in that regard. It wouldn't end the organization. How the chain of command would play out is uncertain. One of the things that happened here along the way is when the leaders of the Islamic State of Iraq were taken out, a guy came into power, Baghdadi, who wasn't necessarily full-blood, I call him, he wasn't full-blood al-Qaeda, right? So eventually he went his own way. You don't know, if you took out Baghdadi, one of the scarier thoughts you could have is, does the group then go back to al-Qaeda's fold? Do they have a leader who takes over and basically can put them back in the other way? It's a possibility, nobody even really knows. But they are starting and have been trying to build this cult of personality around Baghdadi. And the further down that road they get, the more taking him out basically will challenge their structure. Well, it's interesting. I don't know how many people here recently witnessed the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's interview with Jeffrey Goldberg. Did you read that? Read that?
Stupid things.
Well, stupid things, but it was very interesting. Did you see what she said along those lines?
Yeah.
She said that she sees it sort of, and I'm paraphrasing now, but it was sort of that a Cold War containment strategy is needed to confront what we're doing with what's going on with jihadism. So what I see what's interesting to me is the elite, some part of the elite knows in the back of their head that all the nonsense that's been blabbered about Al-Qaeda being decimated and this thing's all over with is wrong, right? They know that that threat is growing, you know? There's some part of the elite knows that. Now, what actually will galvanize them into action, I don't know. How will this play out, I don't know. My view is we have time, you know, to reorganize ourselves, and pressure from people is most important, you know, on your elected officials and otherwise, and also getting out there and being advocates for what's going on. But I think the American people, you know, it's interesting. I have faith in the American people more than I do the elite, because the American people, they just look at the TV and they see what's going on and they say, wow, you know, that's a frightening image, you know, what's happening here. This does not look like Al-Qaeda on the run. This does not look like a threat that's over with, you know. And you see with the recent war against Israel, you see this with what Iran's doing. People have there's a palpable tension. People understand that these threats are metastasizing and growing. I think eventually it's going to pop through on the political elite where they're going to have to deal with it in some terms of strategy. But I think ultimately the people have to basically hold their leaders accountable. And so far, you know, that really hasn't come about. Oh yeah, well, the Muslim Brotherhood issue, I mean, that's like a whole nother I know.
Mr. Brennan said.
Well, I mean, you have a lot of apologists for Islamists. I mean, you know, in D.C. and elsewhere. I mean, let's just be blunt. You have a lot of people who basically thought the Muslim Brotherhood and these organizations were going to be a bulwark against the jihadists, and that was their whole idea, was that the Islamists basically were going to prevent, you know, the jihadists from becoming a bigger threat. I have wholeheartedly endorsed the opposite view, that oftentimes the Islamists and the Brotherhood, you know, serve as a gateway for these organizations. I mean, all you have to do is look at the biographies of the senior al-Qaeda leaders. Just go down the line, right? Right? Go down the line. Time and time again, they started somewhere in the Brotherhood. Time and time again. And basically, they decided that the Brotherhood's tactics at the moment were not sufficient. But they were very much tactical differences, not strategic long-term differences. And there are all sorts of unconfirmed reports out of Egypt of what happened during President Morsi's reign, for example. Look, go back to the morning of September 11th, 2012. Okay? This is before Benghazi. What happens out front of the U.S. Embassy in Cairo? The brother of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the brother of al-Qaeda's senior leader, leads that protest, which becomes a riot at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. And they fly. It's not about a video, as everybody said, people were trying to say at the time. The video didn't cause dozens upon dozens of people to raise al-Qaeda flags outside of our embassy. It didn't cause, you know, hundreds of people there to chant, "Obama, Obama, we're all Osama." Okay, I can give you the nerd roster of the senior al-Qaeda jihadists who stood out in front of our embassy and led the charge there. What happened to those guys under Morsi's regime? Did he crack down and arrest them? Did he put them in jail? No, he didn't. You know, these are guys who were, you know, very openly al-Qaeda. Now, did the Brotherhood and al-Qaeda have differences? Absolutely. Sometimes vehement disagreements. But they're much closer to al-Qaeda than they are us. That's a simple fact of the matter. And oftentimes you find the Brotherhood is sort of a gateway for these guys. And anyway. I think, well, it's contrary to the Department of State. What's interesting is that the State Department actually has an initiative to fight these guys online, on Twitter and elsewhere, to try and counter-message them. And it's sort of a, I don't think it's a heavily funded effort, but it's a start in that regard. But the bottom line is, a democracy, you know, we in the West are intellectually confused right now, aren't we? About what we are and what we stand for, and we're not even confident enough to basically spread our own ideas around the world. You know, we're not even confident enough to say, you know, I'm an American and I stand for all these things. You know, at this point, you know, we don't do that sort of promotion of our ideas, which is ultimately what you need for democratically functioning societies. And when I say about that, what I mean that is that if we can't even efficiently promulgate our own ideas about who we are, right, then we're really not well positioned to fight the bad guys' ideas. You know, and so right now there's such intellectual confusion across the board that, you know, we're not really fighting them in the war of ideas. We have a few sort of haphazard sort of, you know, initiatives here and there that bubble up. But, you know, look, just something as simple as saying, you know, here are our allies throughout the greater Middle East, and we're going to stand united in coalition. There's going to be Kurdish leaders, Israel, there's going to be this group, that group, and look, America's leading, and you guys are on our team, and we're going to fight these enemies together, right? Even something as simple as that we don't do, right? And say in terms of identifying common threat. You know, my boss, Cliff May, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, had a great column just recently where he just made that simple point. You know, one of the things you should do is the start point to figure out how to fight jihadism is to just identify your allies. You know, look, we're all opposed to the same thing in different forms, and this is basically our team, you know? And it starts with just very simple messaging like that, I think, you know? And then start challenging them more holistically in terms of their messaging, because there's all sorts of ways we could be causing problems for them in terms of propaganda, in terms of messaging, and otherwise, and we're just not doing it. I would say it's not Iran, but I think it's even worse than what you said, which is that are the same mechanisms that sponsor terrorism and also oppress the Iranian people. So there should be a common bond there between us and at least a segment of the Iranian population. And yet the U.S., especially under this administration, has decided not to play that card, right? Has decided that, you know, we're going to deal with the Iranian regime, we're not going to speak out on behalf of the Iranian people who are oppressed by the Iranian regime. That's not just strategically short-sighted, that's morally hollow. Okay? That basically says you don't have, you know, any kind of moral fiber to stand for what's right in the world, you know? And essentially, there are all sorts of Iranian people who have risen up against, in fact, 2009, risen up against the regime. Where was the American leadership at that point in time to say, look, we don't want to rule Iran, we want you to rule Iran, and we're on your side, you know? Just a simple message, you know? We couldn't even do that, you know? So I think it's getting worse.
Well, what's interesting is the Islamic State already has some, it appears they already have some small pockets in Gaza and elsewhere which are sort of agitating for attacks against Israel. What's interesting about all of this is there's a dynamic in play here that I think has been broadly missed in the commentary on the current war, which is that Israel, for the first time, has what are often described as global jihadists around all its borders, whether it be in Sinai, or in Gaza, or next to Golan Heights, or operating as a logistical network in Jordan, Lebanon, you know. And this is a different threat that's emerging for Israel than it's dealt with in the past. In the past, it's been Hamas, which has taken, in the jihadi terms, they've taken a more nationalistic approach, right? Here you're dealing with guys, sometimes they're connected to Islamic State, sometimes they're connected to al-Qaeda, sometimes we don't know if they're connected, but they share that same ideology, right? This is potentially a huge problem for Israel in the long run, although we don't know how great yet. You know, one of the things we covered going back to 2011, for example, is we saw for the first time some more, actually in many years anyway, some spectacular terrorist attacks coming out of Sinai in Israel, cross-border attacks. You remember there was a bus that was basically assaulted in sort of a Mumbai-style attack where they shot the bus and tried to, you know. Basically what's happening is these types of groups are putting pressure on Hamas and other groups to be more forward-leaning in their attacks against Israel. What they're saying is, you know, Hamas and you guys, you know, up until recently anyway, you're cowards, you're not taking the fight to Israel, we're going to take it to them. Now they're much smaller, they're much, you know, they're much, you know, closer to the nascent position than they are well established. But they're coming, they're building up their forces, and you see that in Sinai, again, all of the terror in Israel. And that to me is, if you project this out, that's potentially a big problem in the long run. I'm sure there is a strong case where I haven't read the piece, so I don't want to address the arguments exactly. I wish I had. What happened? I mean, I was asked this recently. There's this idea that we can split Iraq into 3 different entities and draw borders, and basically that would solve things. This doesn't solve things, okay, for a lot of reasons. One, the Islamic State is a transnational jihadist group. They're not just part of Sunni Iraq. They're, you know, fighting everywhere. They're going to Syria, and they're trying to establish their own hub. Now, will the Kurdish groups across both borders basically link up and create their own Kurdish sort of nation-state counter this? You know, I mean, I don't know. You know, I mean, it's been something that's been in pipelines for a long time. People talk about it, whether it'll ever come out. I mean, I've heard this argument for a long time. They're saying it hasn't come out yet. Doesn't mean it won't come out. But the point is, when it comes to the future of Iraq, I think that it makes much more sense to try and find a way for the Kurdish portion of Iraq to cut deals with and compromise with the other parts of the Sunni allies that are being under attack, and anyway the Shia areas to try and keep that country together than trying to split apart. For a variety of reasons, I think if you have that sort of political jostling, you can basically mitigate some of the sectarianism that we have. But that's, you know, again, it's not been accomplished, so, you know, it's easier said than done, right? Basically, my answer when I was asked this on an appearance on Fox News on Happening Now, in a live interview, they said, what do you think about dividing Iraq into 3 parts? I said, right now, nobody's dividing anything into parts other than the Islamic State. They're the only ones that are redrawing boundaries right now. You know, the international community has no capacity to basically do any of this.
We have time for one more.
Yeah, Jordan certainly sees an increasing threat stream there for sure. You know, what's interesting in Jordan is you basically have a situation where the youth are siding with the Islamic State, and this is what I'm saying earlier with the hotheads, basically. But the key ideologues in Jordan are not. Key ideologues are still fully on board with al-Qaeda, and so, you know, one of the dynamics in Jordan is you see competition then between the two, which ends up increasing the threat stream to the Jordanian government, monarchy, and all that stuff. Very well could be, you know. I mean, you can go back to, because I'm a security firm, so I can read the leaked cables and talk about it. You go back to leaked cables that come out from the State Department, and the Jordanian government has struggled to contain some of these guys. They're an ally. They've struggled to contain these guys for a while now, you know. And so there's always a threat bubbling there that they have to deal with. And yeah, I mean, look what happened in Lebanon. You're watching what's happening in Lebanon now, where you have Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda, answers directly to Ayman al-Zawahiri. You have the Islamic State, you have Hezbollah, you have all these forces now basically going at it in Lebanon now, you know, much more so than before. You know, I mean, the threat is growing, you know, in all these countries.